Invictus doesn't pay for anything, for squat. What is happening? Am I missing something here? What the heck, Harry? That's just gross. Ripple, it does not. When does a charity for wounded heroes transform into a $63 million PR vehicle? And have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle dragged Invictus Games down with them? Recent information about the Invictus Games Foundation and its Endeavor Fund have come to light and are painting a really bad picture of the situation. Invictus Games began with a profoundly noble mission to use sport to help recovery for wounded veterans. But lately, the math isn't mathing on their mission and the way that they run their foundation and program. At roughly $118,000 per competitor, a shockingly low percentage of wounded, injured, or sick veterans participating, and sponsors opting out of renewing their contracts, like a mass exodus of sponsors, really, from 44 at the last games to only 11 for next year's games, and the revelation that internal spending has gone up while spending directly on veterans has gone down. It's time to ask the tough questions about the Invictus Games. The accusations that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's influence and expenses and control are becoming a bigger and bigger problem are becoming impossible to ignore. Has their deep, insatiable desire for a massive global stage led Invictus Games down a path of financial ruin? And is Harry's ego behind this insistence for this Olympic scale of an event overshadowing the actual needs of the vets and causing failure within the organization? Hi everybody, I'm Beebs Kelly. Welcome back to another video. Today's video is exposing the trouble behind the scenes at Invictus Games, and all roads lead back to Prince Harry. It is his, isn't it? He is the founder, creator, mastermind of the Invictus Games, is he not? So all of these problems should be landing squarely on his shoulders. But by the end of today's video, you will see what the real problem is. Before we dive in, I would like to invite you to subscribe if you have not yet already. Click like and hype this video if you wish. Also, leave a comment down below on your guess of what percentage of wounded, injured, or sick veterans are actually participating in the Invictus Games. It's so much lower than I thought. So the debate over the Invictus Games often centers on whether the mega event model that they currently use really serves the veterans, or if it serves the public image of its leadership, i.e. Harry. And a lot of people have focused their complaints over the last few games, the last few biennial events, on Meghan Markle's pushy involvement. She definitely does have a habit of pushing her way into giving speeches, leading teams in their march, like just weird stuff that she's been doing at the games. But behind the scenes, a slower burn problem has been surfacing, and it is reaching a tipping point now. And these problems rest squarely on Harry's responsibility here. There is a growing perception among some veterans and commentators that the games have shifted focus from rehabilitation to brand building. And this is evidenced by the over 2,000 members who have resigned from the Invictus community in recent years, citing frustration that the organization has lost its meaning. Some former military personnel have publicly labeled the approach of the Invictus Games as narcissistic, suggesting that veterans feel like supporting roles in a PR exercise designed to uplift Harry specifically, leading to accusations that the event is just a vanity project. And the Invictus Games, their internal sort of like theory and format and how they justify this really just includes a lot of mental gymnastics to try to support the model that they seem fixated on keeping. Staging the biennial Invictus Games costs between $60 and $65 million. And this budget is primarily spent on logistics, stadium rentals, broadcasting, and marketing. Their year-round activities include what they're calling Beyond the Games, which is a relatively new initiative, which is really just an app for the athletes to be able to communicate in between the games. It really doesn't even make that much sense in terms of like having an impact. But anyway, their total expenditure on all charitable activities, including staff and digital platforms like the We Are Invictus platform only cost about $3.28 million in 2024. The direct grants that they have given to veterans, despite spending millions of dollars on the events, was only £200,000 in 2024, which is a 63% decrease. And here's the real kicker. They actually had an increase in their cash reserves during that same period of time. How did they spend it? Not on the veterans. They spent it on hiring more staff, getting paid 6 figures a year. How does that make any sense? What I noticed when I investigated this Invictus Game dilemma is that this creates a huge vacuum effect for the veterans. Veterans come and participate. Only about 500 to 550 veterans have ever participated per Invictus Games event, meaning the whole week of Invictus activities. There's a total of like 500 about athletes coming and participating. For them, after a huge event that they've spent 2 years working towards, then it's just suddenly over. And veteran advocates note that without consistent year-round engagement, these athletes are facing a post-games come down. There's a huge vacuum after the events are over where there's really nothing and there's a lack of direction. And oftentimes these high numbers of improved PTSD results and improved sense of community and these positive metrics that Invictus Games puts on their website all the time, that the Invictus Games makes such a huge difference for these athletes and veterans that come, is skewed. Because that's an immediately after the games, how do you feel? As you're leaving the games, you're still on that high from the event. Once they're home, these veterans advocates are noting that people are having struggles post-games in that 2-year gap to sort of bounce back from that huge adrenaline surge. Recently, the Invictus Games Foundation has expanded its Beyond the Games engagements. In 2024, they supported 788 individuals, which is about 250 more than that participated. But this outreach is still only reaching a fraction of the global veteran population compared to the resources poured into the main competition. Unlike the Warrior Games that they have in the United States, which are a permanent part of the U.S. military's year-round clinical recovery path, the Invictus model is more like a traveling circus that needs to be resold to a new host city every 2 years, which means a huge amount of internal energy is spent on just securing the next country to foot the bill for the biennial games. But Invictus Games claims that the big cost of these huge events is necessary as an investment to generate the media attention required to secure corporate sponsorships, which in turn funds their digital community and smaller grants year-round. Make that math make sense. If you're saying that this is an investment, like with any investment, you need to see a good, solid return on your investment, or else it's a bad investment. If they are only spending $200,000 on direct grants and the cost to run and maintain the digital platforms could be handled way less than a $3.28 million budget, like that's just overblown for an online platform and an app, that's insane, then where is the money going? It's all going into the actual Invictus Games events every other year. So before we evaluate that impact and whether that investment is actually delivering results and returns to the community that Invictus Games is set up to serve, let's just take a closer look at their income. In 2024, there was a 41% increase from the previous year in income. However, that was primarily driven by donations and legacies rather than any new corporate sponsorships. Prince Harry has historically made significant personal contributions, like donating damages from one of his lawsuits in the amount of $1.5 million. There's no documented proof, get this is about to make you mad, of Archwell Foundation donating even a cent to Invictus Games. None directly to the Invictus Games Foundation whatsoever. That seems like a big plot hole. I didn't expect that. You'd think that Archwell Foundation would want to be plastered all over Invictus Games as a major sponsor. But no, No. That just goes to show that the Sussexes would rather use the Invictus Games to uplift themselves and bill a lot of their expenses to, rather than actually help the Invictus Games survive. Additionally, major brands that have previously sponsored the games have withdrawn, including Netflix, Salesforce, and Monster Energy. None of them have renewed their high-level partnerships, and despite record income and a dip in sponsorship participation, the foundation has shifted how it spent money since 2024. There are new six-figure roles being added to the executive tier of Invictus Games. The top paid staffer is earning over 120 to 130,000 pounds annually, which is well above the standard for a UK charity of this size. And to just put this into context of how irresponsibly they are spending the money, the millions of dollars, if they redirected that biennial budget into direct-to-veteran grants of $2,500, which is a standard amount for other veteran charities like the VFW, they could help and give grants to thousands of people every year. But instead, they have increased their staffing costs, their cash reserves grew to over 2.3 million pounds, and their legal fees jumped up by over 200%. They went from 45,000 pounds to 150,000 pounds. They claim that over 90% of their total funds go to charitable activities. But what they're getting away with here is that they include the Invictus Games events, putting on that event every other year as a charitable activity. Literally, almost all the budget goes to those biennial events. Almost none of it goes directly to the veterans or to ongoing between games support. And this recent news about the finances and the lack of sponsors is exactly why this argument is coming up and these criticisms are coming up of the Invictus Games of spectacle versus substance. What Harry wants is for the Invictus Games to basically be like the Olympics, where it's a global thing and it goes to different places every time it happens, and it's just this huge big deal that cities are willing to put forth millions of dollars from their budget, taking that away from the citizens that need it. And because he wants it to be this Olympics-style event, it reminded me of how the most recent Olympics in Paris shifted to a sustainability format where no new buildings are to be erected and all of the events are to take place at existing structures, even if that means spreading the events around the region. And it was hugely successful. Invictus Games could totally do something similar to solve a lot of these problems. And the Olympics prove that you can do things in a more regional capacity and still get the glossy PR that Harry so desperately craves. What these details do is expose the lack of priorities to the veterans themselves that they are there to help. Also, in recent years, over 50% of the total cost to put on the Invictus Games has been covered by the local governments that are hosting the Invictus Games. And we have seen time and time again that this does not deliver an economic return, especially not the Invictus Games with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle attached. The Olympics does tend to deliver some degree of economic return. However, it is very brief and short-lived. It is not sustained economic return. So it very often ends up costing the host country rather than boosting their economy significantly. Invictus Games recently said that they are justifying the raising of internal costs by shifting their focus from being a grant giver to a service provider. What that means is that they are using that language to say, basically, we're just worried about putting on the big event, okay? We're providing a service. We're providing a service that is so good for these veterans. That's what this charity is about. That's what Invictus Games is putting on this big event that's such a great service for people. But the reality doesn't match that. Additionally, they justify the addition of these six-figure executive roles and the leap in higher legal costs as necessary to manage multi-million-pound government sponsorships, as well as setting up host city agreements. What that means is that these higher costs and lower grants directly to the veterans is directly tied to this Olympic format. By insisting on continuing to do it this way, where it goes around the globe and is this huge event, they are seeing their costs rise higher and higher and higher just to put on this event, which is eating away at what they could do for the veterans. Not to mention the fact of what we're going to get into next, that this event itself doesn't actually have any data to support this impact that they are claiming. And they're further manipulating the situation by reporting to the UK Charity Commission that 92% of its spending goes towards these charitable activities. But the actual cost of staging the games, including the stadiums, the travel, the logistics, the salaries of staff who directly manage these things, and the cost of Harry's participation, all fall under that 92% expense. And this is a red flag. This is exactly why we see sponsors leaving, because when we see charitable spending, we expect that to mean it's going straight to the veterans, not going to put on an excessively large event. What this shows us is that Invictus Games and Harry are prioritizing brand promotion over individual welfare of the veterans. And for somebody who claims to be such a big part of the veteran community and cares so much about the veteran community, that's just gross. And before anybody has a chance, especially Harry, to say that this all is happening and the financial struggles are happening because the royal family are so mean, because remember, Prince Harry can't take responsibility for anything. No, he always blames the royals, who he hasn't even spoken to in 5 years. Here's the facts behind the history of royal funding for Invictus. When Harry left and Megxit occurred, rather than cutting off support, the Royal Foundation, which helped fund the initial Invictus Games and setting up the Invictus Games organization, transferred the Endeavor Fund to the Invictus Games Foundation in June of 2020, which transferred all assets and ongoing work of the Endeavor Fund, which allowed Harry to continue his work with veterans independently. The foundation post-exit has increasingly relied on sponsorships, private donations, and significant public funding from host governments because Harry by himself is not the same as Harry with the backing of the royal family and the royal foundation. It's just not the same. People don't view it the same if it's just Harry versus Harry, working member of the royal family. And you'll recall, Prince Harry got the idea for the Invictus Games from the Warrior Games in the United States. But the Warrior Games is funded in a completely different way. For those who don't know, it's actually part of the Department of Defense appropriations. It's in the budget for the military expenses. Absolutely everything. The primary funding, the costs of the athletes to attend, the foundation budget, the administrative ratio, all of that is covered with the Department of Defense operations and their budget. And they operate on a budget of about $2 million to $2.7 million annually for specific sporting support, showing that if you change the model, you can have a much bigger impact at a much better price point. Whereas the Invictus Games, as you can see, the athlete costs, this is what I find most fascinating or alarming, fall to the national teams or charities. The athletes, just to participate, have to fundraise and find ways to afford to participate. Whereas with the Warrior Games, it's free for you to participate if you want. Everything from travel, food, and attire is covered for the athletes and 2 of their supporters to go to all these events. I mean, that's good. That's how it should be. What the heck, Harry? At the Warrior Games, everything from clothes to souvenirs is paid for. At Invictus, the foundation provides the brand and oversight, but that's it. The governments and the charities have to raise the funds, which are estimated at £26,000 per person for Team UK, to actually send the veterans there. They have to fund their own travel. They have to fund their own uniforms, everything. The Warrior Games, in stark contrast, is a taxpayer-funded recovery program designed for military members, whereas Invictus is a high-profile media event that relies on selling host rights to cities, which then must find their own funding for the events on top of it. Invictus doesn't pay for anything, for squat. What is happening? So I wonder then, is there a good justification? Am I missing something here? Turns out I'm not. Invictus Games Foundation justifies all these costs, arguing that their role is to provide a global platform that inspires millions, rather than just being a small grant-giving charity. The claim that investing in staff and tech allows them to support veterans year-round via Beyond the Games programs rather than just 1 week every 2 years, and that the value of the Invictus Games events themselves is huge. But does that actually hold up to the facts? If that were true, what we would expect to see is improved metrics for the veteran community as a whole. Because the other weird thing is that Invictus Games claims that this is a ripple effect situation, which we're going to get to in a moment. Ripple it does not. But if what Invictus Games is selling and saying and justifying is true, we would see a wide scope of support and beneficial outcomes. But the facts do not support this. Invictus Games is operating as a media-first brand that is relying on global attention to unlock funding, and that model is failing, as evidenced by going from 44 sponsors to 11 sponsors in less than 2 years. And because Invictus Games is losing sponsors at a massive rate, they're having to rely on the host governments more and more and more. Long-term corporate interest is softening. It forces the foundation to lean more heavily on one-off government grants to maintain this Olympic-style scale. Basically, what this is that they are outside the scope of their capabilities at this point. Another argument that Invictus tries to use to defend this shit model, the media focus and the high internal costs are necessary to create a home for respect that changes societal attitudes towards veterans globally. So I investigated that as well. Really, the only metric they have for this, besides immediately surveying athletes as they leave the Invictus Games events, which of course they're on a high, so they're going to be like, yes, this was great. There's no follow-up data to show the crash that the veterans organizations have cited. The only other metric they have is that they surveyed people online, about 1,500 people online who were already warm to the Invictus Games brand, who said that there was an 8% increase in understanding of veterans. More on that in a moment. What we're seeing here is growing irrelevance for Invictus Games, led by Harry specifically. They are vulnerable to the public's waning interest in the celebrity of its leadership. As Harry's popularity has decreased, so too has Invictus Games' funding, support, and sponsorships. What I found to be most upsetting is the complete just cognitive dissonance that Invictus Games is engaging in here. We know that consistent supports are shown to be much more valuable than one-off or infrequent big events to wounded, injured, and sick veterans. When the actual one-week event is over or not happening, or those athletes that didn't get picked to go, they are left with isolation, and they're vulnerable to increased challenges during that time. So while participating in the Invictus Games can be transformative for the individuals involved, for those who are not, there is no evidence of a ripple effect. In fact, quite the opposite. Because if Invictus Games wants their current structure and what they envisioned for the games to be doing to actually be working, then we should be able to see measurable impact that justifies it. But we don't. Even though the few who do participate say that it is and can be transformative. That is a tiny fraction of the community of wounded, injured, and sick veterans worldwide. Like it's a tiny, tiny fraction. So now it's time to check your comments down below. Remember, I told you to guess what percentage of wounded, injured, sick veterans are actually participating in the Invictus Games community. Well, it's shockingly low. It is less than 0.1% of the national wounded, injured, or sick veterans. So while the benefits of the Invictus Games participation is limited to a tiny fraction of the community, it consumes a disproportionate share of global veteran resources. The percentage of veterans who participate in the biennial Invictus Games is less than 0.02% of the global population of these people. The Vancouver Whistler Games hosted 534 competitors from 23 nations. There was 550 competitors in 2023. In the US alone, though, there are over 4.8 million veterans with service-connected disability. There was 1,194 veterans taking part in the Invictus Games Beyond the Games activities in 2025, which is that like tiny bit of in-between games activities that they've funded, which accounts for approximately 0.025% of the US disabled veteran population alone, not to mention the global population. For every one veteran who competes on the global stage at Invictus, there are thousands of others who receive no direct funding or participation opportunities from the foundation at all. For example, Team UK for 2025 had only 64 members, and their justification that there's a ripple effect of global awareness is not backed up by data at all. And at this point, with how many years of doing the Invictus Games, you would expect to have a lot of data to support this and justify it. No wonder sponsors are like, nah, we're not going to do this. You don't even have any data to prove that any of this is working, because it's not. Less than 0.1% of the national wounded, injured, and sick veterans population get to participate. That is grossly inappropriate. What? How does Invictus Games acknowledge this gap? They state that the selection of athletes who get to come is based on the impact joining will have on the wounded, injured, and sick in their home nation rather than sheer volume of people. That's that impact word that Harry and Meghan absolutely love to use. The reality is that that impact never materializes. They only feature data on the very tiny sliver of people that do get to participate, having positive psychological outcomes immediately after the games. That is the only data that Invictus Games shows. They also measured their impact through public perception, noting that 8% I was telling you about, an 8% increase in understanding of veteran sacrifices in host regions like British Columbia in 2025. What that actually means is that the ripple effect of psychological benefits is primarily concentrated among participants only, rather than the broader non-competing veteran population. Because this survey had a statistical sleight of hand. And this is very common in PR for mega events. Every time there's a mega event that takes taxpayer money, people want to justify it and show that there was this big positive impact. And so this happens a lot. But this was a survey of only 1,500 people. That may be a standard sample size for a local city or a small province, but it is not scalable to claim a global impact like Invictus is trying to. If they had surveyed the entire, like a representative population for the global population, they would not have gotten to an 8% increase in understanding. What nonsense. What this is proximity bias. If you live in a city where the games are happening, of course you're going to see the banners and hear the news. And if you're asked, do you understand more? The natural social response is to say yes. This does not mean that the person in Toronto, London, or Sydney who didn't have the event in their backyard experienced the same shift. To claim a global ripple effect, as Invictus Games does, based on a local sample, is a massive reach. It's convenience sampling. They were already warm to the brand. 1,500 people cannot represent the diversity of a global population of billions. The very scale that Invictus Games claims is justified. They're claiming we have a global impact, global awareness, ripple effect globally. No, they don't. And this ties into Harry and Meghan's recent tours, their faux royal trips to Australia and other places previously. They are going on this model that awareness will lead to compassion, which will directly lead to funding and support. But that never materializes. The reality is, in a crisis-fatigued economy, people may feel 8% more compassionate while watching a glossy video of Harry, but they aren't necessarily opening their wallets or voting for better veteran legislation. While the public may feel better, the actual tangible benefits or grants for the veterans decreasing shows that the understanding didn't translate into more money for the people who need it. It translated into higher cash reserves for Harry and his foundation. This is what I was saying with their tours, that when they go to the Royal Hospital in Australia or other charities, like they went to a Veterans Art Museum and a women's shelter, like these activities billed as awareness visits where they did not donate any money actually don't translate to benefits for those charities or causes. They just don't, not this day and age. So the model of Invictus Games is now the same as the model for Archwell Foundation philanthropies. That's wild. That just goes to show how much influence Harry has over this huge organization of Invictus Games, and how he's leading it down the wrong path. More alarmingly, When a wounded, injured, or sick veteran in a vacuum of support sees a $60 million event where one of their peers gets $118,000 worth of experiences, it can breed resentment and a sense of exclusion. It reinforces the idea that support is a lottery or a beauty pageant for the most inspiring stories, rather than a consistent right for all who served our countries. The 8% figure is a vanity metric designed to satisfy corporate sponsors who want to be associated with this awareness rather than to prove that a single veteran's life got easier. So in comparison to the Wounded Warrior Project, where over 270,000 warriors, family members, and caregivers were registered with the organization, which was approximately 12% of this specific population in the US, they held over 5,250 connection events, 1,240 peer support group meetings in 2024 alone. They invested over $260 million into programs and services in financial year 2024, with roughly 71% of total funds supporting these direct programs. And like I said, all the expenses of participating are paid for to support the people who sacrificed for our countries. And when we compare the actual metrics to Invictus Games, not only is the actual participant numbers just absurdly dismal for Invictus's core financial focus is rooted in high production media events and brand awareness, whereas the Wounded Warrior Project is focused on direct-to-veteran services, things like mental health, job placement, local events, and sporting activities. The primary outcome metric for Invictus relies on this false belief that it delivers psychological growth for competitors and public empathy levels increase, which we have just debunked. Whereas the Wounded Warrior Project has actual tangible mental health improvements that are measurable, 67% reduced PTSD symptoms, and increased employment. So this just proves that this is all a big ego trip for Harry. He's forcing Invictus Games down this path so that he can continue to have this event that he gets to be the center of attention for, claims he's the sole reason for its existence, and be at the center of attention all week long, leading, like in all the pictures and leading the PR campaign, because it makes him feel special. Because you know what? If he actually cared about the veterans, he would do it differently. Because what he's doing now is not actually delivering value at all, and it seems like a gross injustice in my opinion, which led me to come up with an alternative. If the Invictus Games would abandon their Olympic model that they clearly can't sustain and refocus their current biennial budget into year-round support, they could theoretically fund full-week sports camps for nearly 9,000 veterans every year. It would free up roughly £18 million per year for direct programming. Instead of flying 500 athletes to one location every 2 years, they could provide weekly adaptive sports programs at an estimated cost of $2,000 per attendee, support 8,750 veterans per year in their home countries, which remember, we're talking about wounded, injured, and sick veterans. It's not exactly easy or pleasant to have to fly if you're already dealing with physical challenges. They could also fund hundreds of peer-led local chapters like the Endeavor Fund's original model back when it was under the Royal Foundation, which would provide a safety net that prevents that isolation vacuum in between the games. And they could increase their direct grant giving from the current $200,000 to £5 million per year and still have millions left over for their online platforms and other services. And the foundation argues that without their big show of the Invictus Games every other year, they would lose the celebrity and media leverage required to attract private sponsors and governments. That their marketing engine is what makes all other funding possible. They would lose their global brand status by trying to provide more consistent localized support to a larger number of people, but I solved that problem too. They could still host an annual or a biannual foundation fundraising concert event. That could tour around and just be a concert where celebrities come and perform for free and people buy tickets because it goes to a good cause. Why not? And that could still provide an opportunity for all the glossy PR and things of that nature, because they could send Harry to the weekly sports camps throughout the year to different places and get the same exact pictures that they get from the Invictus Games events at smaller regional events. and then show them at an annual fundraising gala and concert and attract sponsors. And the only shift to the format is going from one huge, overblown, overly expensive Olympic-style event to more regional events that, yes, are slightly smaller and less expensive to run, but can deliver the same value in terms of PR for the foundation, but will help the veterans more and better. While it costs $1 million for the Olympic-style stadiums and massive infrastructure that they currently use for their model, they could spend only thousands on local convention centers, military bases, and existing sports hubs for regional events like the African regions, European regions, North American regions. They could go from 500 athletes every 2 years to nearly 5,000 athletes annually across regional hubs. And that consistent drip of high-quality content from local news stories and smaller documentaries can be more impactful for fundraising than one massive burst of global PR followed by a long silence, especially when you're dealing with somebody controversial like Harry. And the main barrier to this shift to a regional model from a global model isn't money, it's brand prestige and Harry's ego. That is the only thing holding them back from a very obvious problem. If I can see the solution, the very simple solution and the problems here, and everybody sees the problems and how Invictus is being run, then surely they can see it too. They're choosing to do nothing about these problems. In order to make this work, Prince Harry and the Invictus Games would have to accept a lower production value. There might not be a televised opening ceremony with major pop stars. But in exchange for less gloss, the foundation could support 5 to 10 times more veterans annually with the same amount of effort, virtually eliminating the vacuum between major games and increasing the help for veterans. With a high-profile televised biennial concert, they could still provide the glossy marketing and celebrity appearances that Harry desires through a fundraising gala. And it could serve as a centralized fundraising engine using harvested content from regional events to show donors the real-world impact happening year-round in more local and regional ways. The primary hurdle is the foundation's belief that the Olympic scale is what gives the cause its global leverage. That without the massive stadium spectacle, the foundation fears it would lose its status as a global movement and its ability to secure multi-million-dollar government and corporate sponsorships. But they are already not able to secure and keep their global sponsors. They're already not able to produce any tangible data that they have a global impact at all. In fact, there is growing concerns that this high visibility, large scale model may actually diminish long-term effectiveness by prioritizing branding over the consistent grassroots supports veterans need. While there are initial headlines for these big high-profile events, studies on celebrity advocacy suggest its ability to drive meaningful long-term engagement is limited. Critics argue that these mega events garner more attention for the celebrity patron than for the actual cause, and in Harry's case, more negative press and criticisms of him and Meghan's participation and control over the events. Recent reports suggest that if a patron becomes a divisive figure, as Harry has, their association can eventually stand in the way of the foundation's legacy and its ability to bring people together, which is not rocket science, Harry. And that global leverage, like I said, is usually fleeting. It doesn't usually translate into lasting benefits. Ex-post studies frequently show that the predicted long-term economic gains like tourism and investment from mega events rarely materialize as expected. And research indicates that small to medium-scale sporting events often deliver stronger social benefits to host populations. Smaller events foster a more authentic local sense of community and civic pride without the crowding out effect seen in mega events. Legitimacy in political and charitable authority is often rooted in the authenticity of the work rather than the particular form or scale that it takes. And think about it, for the veterans, from their perspective, being celebrated by strangers once every 2 years and being able to be part of only 500 people total, most of whom are not from your country, means that you're getting support from strangers for a very small amount of time. Whereas if they were doing a more small-scale regional sort of situation, they would be getting support and encouragement from the very people that they rely on daily, their own community. People who they are part of a community with is who they would be feeling support from and teamwork with. and they would get to participate with more people from their community who they know. The bottom line is that there is major ethical concern at this point over Invictus Games. A single week of PR costing millions versus direct support for veterans. Large-scale charities have historically faced scrutiny for lavish spending on luxury hotels and conferences for staff, which can be perceived as straying from the mission of helping veterans. And we see that materializing here. The strategic decision-making in sustainability often involves balancing the infinite mindset of long-term goals with the immediate finite needs of current stakeholders, and in this case, the veterans who need daily support. So it's time for people to start posing the question to the Invictus Games and to Harry himself. Why aren't they actually meeting the mission statement of Invictus to help the veterans and have a global impact? It means greater access, more people across the globe, not global press that does nothing for the cause. But leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining me for my rant. I hope you have a happy day ahead, and I'll see you next time. Bye.